So yeah, buildings are responsible for a lot of our environmental problems, and particularly climate change, carbon emissions, and so forth. So I suppose you could say I'm here doing penance for my industry, which I've been in for upwards of 35 years now. So what I'm going to do today, I have a relatively short presentation. Then I have your questions, which are terrific. So I was quite pleased with them because you've given me great fodder. When I'm teaching my own classes, I always promise there will be at least one rant. And I think you've given me several cues that could provoke good rants here. So that's the goal in every class. And then I will just sort of open it up to Q&A. Okay? So this is a variation of a presentation I did for the Building Enclosures Sustainability Symposium, BESS. I don't know if any of you heard about that. It was at Cal Poly Pomona in June, and it's part of an international conference series, World Sustainable Building. And it's a very interesting series, by the way. You should certainly be aware of it. It's an international cycle developed by ISBE, which I believe is the International Institute for the Sustainable Built Environment, which is kind of a not very visible, but very important group of international leaders in the sustainable built environment. Ray Cole at University of British Columbia, Nils Larsen, who's someplace in Eastern Canada, Christina Duplessis in South Africa, and a number of other folks. And they initiated this conference cycle, which consists of a planning year, a year in which there are regional conferences all over the world, and 2013 is one of the regional conference cycle years, and then the third year, which is the World Sustainable Building Conference, that's next October in Barcelona. So if any of you are interested, that would be a fabulous conference to participate in. At the symposium in Cal Poly Pomona this summer, there were a lot of international students. So it's a very nice conference in that it's relatively small, I'd say in the maybe 400 to 600 range. So it's neither tiny nor humongous like Green Build, which is our flagship conference in the building industry, green building industry. So a lot of diversity, but a lot more players from academia than we normally see, and especially fresh ideas coming from students, which is really exciting. So I would really encourage you to look into that some more. So I did this paper there knowing that there was a lot of interest in education in that audience, and because education is a real passion of mine as a means of accelerating the transformation of the built environment. Because if we don't know how to do it differently and better, then we won't do it differently and better. And our industry is very change averse, the building industry. So it requires a little, prodding, nudging, pitchforking to move things along. So that's kind of where this comes from. Now, and I should say too, I've focused for the last about 4 or 5 years on zero net energy in particular. I was very involved in the development of LEED for homes for the U.S. Green Building Council. I chaired the development of that program for several years leading up to its pilot and launch, and then helped a number of projects get started in the pilot, nurtured those programs. And then I sort of said, okay, what's next? I'm always kind of looking for the next bigger lever. How do we move this industry along? Give me a cattle prod, right? So I thought, well, climate change is really, in my view, arguably the most pressing crisis facing the building industry in particular. And I felt that zero net energy, which was bubbling up as an area of interest, wasn't getting the interest that it needed. And also, I knew a lot about it, but I'd been studying in this field for 15 years by then and had 20 more years behind me in professional practice to build on. And that's not a very efficient way to provide tools to people who are interested. So I thought, maybe I should write a book. So I did. Wrote a book called Energy Free, Homes for a Small Planet. I apologize. I should have brought a copy to show you, but I didn't. Woe is me. That's in my trunk. If we had time, I suppose I could run and go get it. And so that's been a real focus. So the original title said Zero Net Energy Building Education Manifesto, but really these principles apply universally across the field of sustainable building. So, we're looking at this, and what we mean by sustainable building, of course, is not that we know what a sustainable building looks like. You guys read the reading, right? So it's really not an adjective describing the building. It's more, I like to think of it, Jason McLennan, who wrote that chapter in the book, thinks of it as a philosophy. I prefer to think of it as navigational guidance. This is a compass direction in which, we hope to be heading. So that's kind of my view of sustainable building. And again, the core pieces for market transformation are the same, regardless of sort of how you approach that. So my arguments for this revolve around the fact that our challenges in achieving high performance in buildings actually aren't technological, primarily. We tend to see a lot of emphasis on technology. In fact, if anybody goes to Greenbuild, which is a couple of weeks hence in Philadelphia, it's a huge, 30, 40,000 people at this conference and an enormous trade show floor full of technologies. And there is a place for technologies. They can help us achieve, more course correction in that guidance towards sustainable building, whatever that might look like in the future. But there are so many things that we know how to do now, and we don't do them well or consistently. So this is just one example. In a conventional home, we have rules of thumb that govern the way our building trades and contractors size air conditioning systems. So in a standard building that doesn't have, any real particular attention to the quality of the building enclosure, that is its thermal integrity, and using rules of thumb, we would have, for example, a 4-ton air conditioner. If we do a good job with the thermal enclosure, we can actually reduce the loads by half. If we install the system properly, we can get twice the performance out of a given piece of equipment, with the net effect that we could get away with a 1-ton air conditioner instead of a 4-ton. And you'll see my little caveat here, the asterisk note. Oh, right, and by the way, we could also have smaller ducts that are easier to fit within the pressure and thermal boundaries, so really might even be under 1 ton. Oh, right, except we have trouble finding systems that small, so that's where the technology piece comes in. But it is possible. We have people who are sort of rejiggering existing equipment to get smaller capacity out of it. So why doesn't that happen? It's because we're not doing these things intelligently. It is possible to build this thermal enclosure. It is possible to do a quality installation of the HVAC system, but we just kind of don't seem to produce an industry that does that. So we need to educate. Another example, so Occupants. For many years when I was working on LEED for Homes, part of my job was to go out and speak at conferences and meetings and talk about what the U.S. Green Building Council was trying to accomplish with this new rating system for homes, and to find out from these audiences what should this program do, what should it be, how should it transform the industry. And there were a number of things that I learned in the course of going out and meeting with people, many of whom were green builders who'd been producing very green homes for a long time. And one of the things that they would very predictably say is, we build the greenest houses and then people move in. And those people, they don't know how to operate those homes. So we say, okay, well, I'm not sure we can operate the homes for the people, but we certainly need to be thinking more creatively and cleverly about how we design with the occupant in mind and how we engage occupants successfully. So, and we start to realize this is even more important, and in California in particular, but certainly nationally and internationally, as we have addressed energy efficiency in buildings, we've come to understand how to make a more thermally efficient enclosure, you know, how to size equipment smaller and so forth, even if it's not done universally and done well. This is understanding that is certainly very accessible. As we do those things well, we find that the plug load piece, which is the things the occupants bring into their homes and that they are in charge of operating, become a more and more dominant piece of the energy equation. So on the left, your left, the normal distribution of loads in a residential pie, you see plug loads are the yellow wedge at about 17%. And these are, of course, averages, and they're going to change from place to place. In a more efficient enclosure, when you reduce those loads, then you see, without doing anything with plug loads, all of a sudden they're a bigger piece of the problem that remains to be solved. So this also is not a technological problem. This is a people problem. So how do we get people to do things differently? Well, we can't do the same thing over and over. This is a fairly well-enshrined bit of wisdom. And it turns out that education is a big part of how we tackle problem solving. And, you know, this is something that's been implicit in my thinking for a long time. But when I was developing this presentation, I went hunting for some quotes because I thought, did I just make this up? That that's the role of education, is to change culture? Well, it turns out, no, I didn't make it up. Again, there are people older and wiser than I who sort of reinforce this notion. And I really love both of these quotes. The first one, of course, because it sort of says exactly what my sort of intuitive premise was, that that is the role of education. But the second one from Jerome Bruner, who's a two-time member, actually, of the President's Science Advisory Committee. I'm going to read it just because I love it so much. And then we have auditory as well as visual absorption. Education must be not only a transmission of culture, but also a provider of alternative views of the world and a strengthener of the will to explore them. Isn't that marvelous, right? So it's not just the information, but there's another way to look at things, and yes, we can create change, right? So this is the role of education. Maybe you didn't know that's why you're here, but it is. So what does that education need to focus on? I've got three principles here. The first one is, and this addresses, at least one of you raised this in your questions. Thank you very much. Rant number 1 coming up. Okay, cost. Green building costs more, doesn't it? No. By the way, which one? Do you remember which one of these waters is yours and which one's mine?
Oh, did I get the water there?
I don't know. Well, I'm going to assume we're not contagious, right? Okay, so it is a very common belief that higher performance buildings cost more to build. But I think that's kind of wrong-headed thinking, because let's suppose you're an engineer on a building project. You're a member of a team. You're given a design charge, and you're given a budget. So if you meet the design charge and you meet the budget, does anything cost extra? Well, do you think it does? You're allowed to answer. This is interactive, right?
No.
Thank you. That's the right answer. No, of course it doesn't. And especially if the design charge says, thou shalt be energy efficient, thou shalt achieve zero net energy, thou shalt reduce carbon emissions. Well, how could it be extra then to do those things. That's absurd. So what we need to be thinking instead is, all right, as a design team, we have this whole toolkit, right? In an airplane, you have this cockpit with all these buttons and levers, right? Well, as a design team, you also have all these buttons and levers that you get to push and pull to make different things happen in the design. And that's exactly what the design process is all about, right? Is manipulating all the variables at your disposal. So you do that, you play with all those variables, including budget, to come up with the desired performance. So this one, I love this, Navigant, highly respected consulting firm. I'm not dissing anybody here, mind you, but, and by the way, peer public interest energy research. This was for many years a publicly funded research program through the state of California. I think they've recently resurrected it and given it a new name, but institutionalized for a long time. So a number of years ago, peer funded a study by Navigant in which Navigant found that there is a $40,000 to $70,000 cost premium for zero net energy homes. And I'm thinking, really, how can that be? If zero net energy was part of the objective of the project to achieve zero net energy, how can it be extra? Well, I realized after gnawing on this problem repeatedly, because I could not accept this. I was rejecting this whole notion. Well, it's because they were basically assuming we're going to take this house, usually a builder, a production model house, and we're going to slap stuff on it to make it zero net energy. Well, okay, sure. If it's applique, if it's an afterthought, and if you're assuming you don't get to change anything, well, sure, it's going to be extra. Anything is going to be extra if it's an afterthought. But if you start with your full toolkit and you get to decide how you're going to expend your budget, then you can prioritize things like what your goals and priorities are. So that's a problem. There is another way of looking at this, my way. I like my way. Unfortunately, I'm not the only one who thinks this way. Ryan Scott is a builder in Canada who's been building zero net energy and other high performance homes for a very long time. He's saying, gee, this makes our houses more saleable and improves our position in the market. Well, isn't that a novel perspective? So, you know, and you could say, oh, sure, well, a zero net energy home, that's a higher quality home. You probably aren't going to get the higher quality product at the same price. Right. But if it also nets you a higher price, then it still doesn't cost more. So there's so many angles on this. And some of them, again, in my view, are kind of wrong-headed and others a little more right. Okay. So that was number one. Cost, we need to recalibrate. The second one, we need to refocus where we put our attention. And this has to do with is it a people problem or is it a technology problem? So when clients come to me, this is another one of those after X number of years of doing this type of work, and mostly my clients come to me when they are looking for some sort of a badge. I want LEED Platinum, I want net zero energy, I want to meet Living Building Challenge on the project. And so I work with them and we try and figure out what are we going to do with this project to make the building meet whatever the performance goals are. Well, what I've realized after a long time is that there's always some sort of, wrinkle, some sort of bump in the road toward achieving those performance goals. And I've realized it's because of an excessive focus on the product with an insufficient focus on the process by which the product is produced. So think about this. It's easier for folks in the building industry to think about another industry and then apply that. So suppose you're Hyundai and you all of a sudden wake up one morning, you're the CEO of Hyundai, and you say, you know what? We're going to go out there and we're going to compete with BMW. We're going to produce high performance vehicles. Okay, how would you do that? A lot of steps. And I've done this with, Q&A and say, so how would you do this? And so I've constructed this as people feed the answers. You might reverse engineer that competing product. You might research new materials and methods. Perhaps go out and find some new vendors because maybe you're not getting the high performance parts that you need. You might actually need to rethink the way things happen in your factory and in your purchasing. So those are procedural things. Redesign the actual production process. Is your assembly line all that it needs to be? Is everybody doing exactly the jobs they need to be doing? Maybe not. So maybe the workers need to learn something new. You might actually even need new workers, new people, new skills, new ideas. So there are a lot of building industry parallels here, only we don't tend to think that way, and we need to be thinking that way, because when we start to think in terms of this building the organizational capacity to produce the higher performing product, strangely enough, it's a lot easier to do that than if we just leap straight to the end product. Right? It's like if Hyundai said, hey, let's do BMWs. Oh, goody, let's go pick the new carpet. Probably not going to get there real successfully. But strangely enough, that's a lot of what we see in the building industry is let's pick new carpet or let's pick a new paint formulation. No, actually, it's much deeper, more structural and more systemic than that. And we need to understand how we as architects, engineers, consultants, energy experts are part of the process that creates the product. Okay, integrated project delivery. Good afternoon. So the third focus for education in this field, I believe, has to be, again, this is process-oriented. The way our industry normally approaches the creation of buildings is in a sequential handoff mode. So I am the brilliant architect. I conceive of my fabulous design, which tends to be very aesthetically focused. I hand it off to a structural engineer, for example, and say, now, Leslie, could you make this stand up, please? And Leslie says, yeah, okay, I'll do my best. She does her best, scratching her head the whole way. Now, why did she do this? Oh, if only she'd asked me about this, it would have been so much better. I imagine there are parallels in other engineering fields too. And in turn, it gets handed off to maybe a mechanical consultant, say, okay, now, could you please make this comfortable? Or at least not so uncomfortable anybody sues? Because really, we don't actually pay that much attention to comfort in our buildings, which you might infer by how uncomfortable many buildings are. Each of the occupations, in turn, receives a pessimized product that they are then expected to band-aid to the best of their ability and then hand on to the next. So this doesn't really make the best use of all of the skills and knowledge and capabilities on the project team, right? If you're somewhere downstream from the brilliant idea where it started, you're probably wishing that somebody had talked to you earlier in the process so that you could actually impart your knowledge and your insights. And of course, when we're working on high-performance buildings, oftentimes our design teams are really smart, resourceful people. And we actually would benefit tremendously by hearing from them. So, and what we have here, you guys, have you all had calculus and all that kind of stuff? Yeah, so, right, this is a fun thing. It takes me back to those nerdy days when I had calculus and engineering and whatnot. On the x-axis of this graph, we have time. On the y-axis, we have common understanding. And you'll see these various benchmarks as we go along. An architect is hired, engineers are hired, the general contractor is hired, and eventually the major trades, and then other trades. So as more people are brought in, you can see that the common understanding graph climbs. Well, when does the common understanding graph peak? Answers.
Yeah.
At the end. Is that a really useful time to achieve common understanding?
No.
Not so much, right? So you can think of common understanding as the area under the graph, right? All right, so let's look at another approach. In an approach called integrated project delivery, we bring everybody on board pretty early, really, really early. The earlier the better. So you have your common understanding curve climb out really quickly, achieve a peak very, very early on, and look what happens to the area under the graph. The overall common understanding in this project is dramatically higher than in the conventional delivery model. So here's a fun thing to think about. There are, oh goody, and I have a whiteboard. Okay, so now you really do have to say stuff. There are a bunch of things besides common understanding that are improved in this model. Can you guess what some of them are? Come on. I know it's after lunch. Efficiency of labor? Yep. That's a good one. What else?
Communication efforts.
Communication what?
Efforts.
Yes.
Plus
Yep. Communication. We'll just say communication. There are many dimensions to that, but yes, that's a very good one. What else?
It's more time effective for everyone to be figuring things out at the same time.
Yep. What else?
Collaboration?
Sorry?
Collaboration, does that fit in there?
Collaboration? Yes. What else? I heard another voice. Less reworks. Absolutely. What else?
Lower cost of materials.
Sorry?
Lower cost of materials.
Lower material costs? Possibly, yeah. Yes, because you can find synergies earlier. And sometimes, yeah, lower, we already said efficiency of labor, so that can also translate to cost. So there are all kinds of dimensions there. What else? There's some human elements too. It's collaboration starts to get at it. What happens here when you bring everybody on board early on?
Do you have the consumer in there?
Ideally, you might. Depends on whether it's a custom project or sort of a speculative for sale project.
Because comfort and usability.
Ability would just skyrocket if so.
Okay, let's see. Comfort and usability, How about team dynamics?
and just a sense of community. Is that what you...
Very good. Yes, sense of community. And what might come from that?
People are more invested in the project and they better effort.
Yeah.
I think they're invested in each other's success.
Bingo. So what happens? Okay. Even in the best of circumstances with the pinnacle of collaboration, there are always still hiccups. So what in the case of a hiccup, do you think the dynamics might change at all?
They're less likely to put it off another portion of the project, so more cooperation to solve that problem.
Yeah, more cooperative problem solving. That's a good one. Okay, see, these things flip. Woo! No, here. Why don't we do this? Yeah, more board. That's always fun. You're having time to think. for more answers here. Such a long list. I love this, and it gets longer every time we do this. Let's see. Red sweatshirt. How about you? Got some ideas?
No, no.
Oh, come on. Try harder. How about you? When people cooperate better, what do they not do as much of? Fight. Yeah. So less fighting, less finger pointing. So yeah, these are some really, really important outcomes. More invested in each other's success, which translates into greater success for the project. And also, so here's a fun little bit of trivia. Of all the professions that touch a construction project at one time or another, what role do you think would be the one of the person who envisioned these graphs, who came up with this idea about how to represent this collaborative process? Ideas? Who would that be? Not the project manager. Good guess, though. Who else? Purple.
The engineers trying to work out each part individually.
No, that's also a good guess, but it's not the engineers. Who else? Go ahead.
Person ordering the supplies.
No, not the supply orderer, not the purchasing person. Who else? Who might think of the world in these terms? Blue.
Architect?
Not the architect. Who else? That's a good. Not the construction people. Oh, now we're getting closer. Not the bank, but we are getting closer.
Consumer?
Not the consumer.
The attorneys. The attorneys.
Ding, 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 ding. That is the correct answer. So this insight arose from when things went south, right? It's like, why didn't they talk to each other? Because really that's a problem. So we're not very clever about talking to each other in this industry, and we need to get a lot better about it. Now, there is a significant obstacle to this. Now, you guys, how many of you have actually been out and worked in the construction field at all? Anybody? No. Okay, so you probably don't know this yet, but one of the significant obstacles to functioning this way is what we call the design-bid-build model. So the project that gets designed, we put it out to bid and then select the builder and it gets built, right? Well, if we think we need to put it out to bid, we're probably not getting the input of the builder during the design process. And we really need that. So one of the challenges that we have to overcome is, how do we get past the mindset that says, oh, but I have to get 3 bids and select the low bid? Because this is a very dominant cultural belief that you have to get 3 bids and maybe pick the low bid, maybe pick the middle bid, but nobody thinks you are going to pick the high bid. But actually, in a high-performance project, the high bid might be the most accurate one. That might represent the perspective of the person who best understood the project, because it's very, very common practice for projects to be underbid and then bumped up through change orders. So we want to avoid that. We want to really understand the project. So there's a catchphrase in our industry, it's measure twice, cut once. My version is design thrice, measure twice, cut once. Let's get it right during the design. It'll never be perfect. Never, never, never. It is not possible for any set of drawings to ever fully embody every single aspect of the design of a building. However, we can get a lot better about it, and especially when we have all the different inputs at the table early on in the process. So we did that already. So yeah, this is, I'm not big on the sports metaphors, but Vince Lombardi got it right here, right? It's that the secret to achieving success is individual commitment to a group effort. And so that means we need all those individuals early. So the fastest way to get to high performance, whether it's zero net energy or whatever other pinnacle of achievement you want in reducing climate change impacts of buildings, is to work together and to think about things differently, to educate all the players to produce the better product. And you know, there's a very pervasive belief that we have to sacrifice something. Green building's going to cost more, and we're going to have to sacrifice something. Well, I don't believe that. And this project was done. It was a pilot that was sponsored by Southern California Edison down in Orange County. And strangely enough, this did not cost more to build than a conventional home of the same size. And the architect who works for, by the way, KTGY is a firm that works for many of the major production builders where cost, constructability, budget, all those core business concerns drive the design and construction. They are very, very business oriented. So this is not a lofty perspective of a pie-in-the-sky architect who has only luxury clients building fancy houses. This is a feet-on-the-ground perspective. And he says, the ABC Green Home uses the same means and methods that any of today's home builders would. The simple footprint and roof form keep it affordable. With a simple architecture detailing, the design can be quite aesthetically appealing to the broadest buyer market. So this is practical. It's not pie in the sky. It doesn't have to cost more, and it doesn't have to sacrifice anything in function, aesthetics, or marketability. That's that. Okay, so let's see, is there an easy way to sort of the slides? We can, okay. This guy, okay, sure. That makes sense. Okay, great, so see, you got a couple rants, so all in one, right? The rant is...
time for questions. This is great.
Mm-hmm.
So I sent
And-
you and the first 12 that had
Come in, I think, by Sunday night. So if
Okay.
you know you put yours in late, or later than that, be ready to get your
Yeah.
hand up too.
And I guess I'll just start at the top, which is probably alphabetically biased or something, but what the heck? So the first one, the question says, sustainable building, rather holistic endeavor. Is the environmental impact greatest due to the materials and energetic costs of construction itself, or of the ways in which we decide to build cities themselves, dense city cores versus suburbs, high-rise versus townhomes, etc.? This is a great question. Who asked? Do you not want to confess? Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's a great question. Because of my background and training, I focus primarily on the building. But actually, I believe that our land use probably trumps, ultimately, when we think about the adverse impacts of sprawl and what that has meant in terms of, so many things. Asphalt coverage and the runoff and groundwater pollution that goes with that, stream siltation, transportation impacts, quality of life issues. You know, very interesting fact, LEED for neighborhood development was developed. It was one of the more recent LEED programs, and it was a unique joint venture between the U.S. Green Building Council, the Congress for New Urbanism, and the Natural Resources Defense Council. And so that's already 3 very significant players coming into it. And then their first major funder was the Centers for Disease Control. And the reason that CDC funded this is because they recognized the connection between things like obesity and heart disease and neighborhood design. So there are so many levels of human impact associated with our actual development patterns on the land. So no hard and fast answers, but I think it's a huge issue. And I think one of the big challenges we're going to face in the 21st century is retrofitting our cities, not just our buildings. We definitely have existing building stock, and several of you asked about that too, but retrofitting our cities and our suburbs for more sustainable lifestyle and reduce carbon impacts. Okay, let's see. What is the best method to encourage sustainable building nationwide? Education. So here you are, graduate from Stanford and then go teach. Or you can teach in a professional setting. I mean, that's basically what I do, right? It's like I teach a bit. Actually, as the years go by, I teach more and more, mostly to adult professional practitioners. And again, I really think that it is the way we think about these problems, so which is a great thing for you to be in this class and thinking about engineering, because it's all about thinking creatively about how you solve problems. And so I think learning to look at these problems through a different lens is the best thing you can do. Okay, how can we decrease the... Yeah. Oh, yes.
Question.
Yeah.
How are you making sure that you're educating the masses? Like, where are you educating? Because if you're just giving lectures to universities, that's kind of like speaking to the choir. Like, they already know. How do you get this knowledge to different, like, not as upper education class environments?
No, that's a really good question, and it's tricky. I think that it's a problem that... Am I throwing him off by moving around or something?
Saving energy.
Yeah, right. It's a problem that has to be tackled at all kinds of levels of society. And so, you know, one of the things that comes up a lot, particularly in the context of some of the work I'm very involved in now at the state level, related to zero net energy and the state's big, bold energy goals. Do they know about this? You guys know about this? So the state of California, actually Governor Schwarzenegger, a number of years ago, issued an executive order that said, basically, by decree, all new homes should be zero net energy by 2020. All new commercial buildings should be zero net energy by 2030. And then there's more about retrofitting existing commercial buildings to be zero net energy as well. So they are called the big bold goals for very good reason. And one of the things that comes up a lot in the stakeholder processes that are being run by the California Public Utilities Commission is we need to get to the consumer, right? Every man and every woman with the message about the importance of this, because we can't create zero net energy buildings unless people demand zero net energy buildings, and so there's a little chicken egg thing going on. The real challenge is that consumer marketing, and it's really what it is, right? If we're promulgating ideas, education and marketing are not exactly the same, but they certainly have a lot in common in terms of influencing thought patterns of the public, right? The idea of both is to influence how people think and what they do. And addressing consumers is hugely expensive. So it's a big challenge. And so, you know, we can look to General Motors and PepsiCo and organizations like that. They're the ones that have the dollar power to address the general public. Some of our institutions do, and again, in California, we are seeing more and more of that. A couple of weeks ago, I chaired an event called the Net Zero North American Leadership Summit that was held down in Irvine in conjunction with the US DOE Solar Decathlon. You guys all know you had a Stanford team at the Solar Decathlon. They rocked. Anyway, so at the Zero Net Energy Summit, one of our speakers was the mayor of Lancaster, California. And he has passed a ruling in his town that says our entire town is going to be zero net energy by 2020. So that is absolutely amazing. And he basically said to everybody in the room, you guys need to be talking to your public officials. So it's not only is it not a technological problem, it's a political problem, cultural and political, right? Politics is part of our cultural apparatus. So yeah, be talking to public officials. A lot of local communities have climate action plans, and we need to see more energy put behind those. But everywhere you go and everything you do, there is an opportunity to change the way people think. And I think one of the things that I have seen in my career in green building is that for some people, as passionate as they might be about climate change and environmental problems, social change in general, there's a little bit of, this is my dirty little secret going on. It's like, I'm kind of a social change, kind of hippie, crunchy kind of person, and I'm not sure I want to reveal that to everybody. Well, you got to get over that, right? Because you don't change anybody's mind if you don't talk to them. So that's one thing I really want to encourage everybody. If you care about this, just engage people at every opportunity. I mean, you don't want to be so aggressive that you frighten them away. But I think it's really important for people to be very frank. I care about this. This is the direction of my career and my personal commitment. And, you know, be as out there as you can, because you will find an audience everywhere. You know, whether you're in school, out of school, in a professional environment. You know, do any of you guys have kids? If you have kids, you talk to people in your kids' schools, you know, other parents, teachers. Every social context you have an opportunity to share a message. Another rant. Thank you. I do so enjoy those. Yes.
Schwarzenegger decreeing the net zero energy buildings, well, homes by 2020. Is that like happening, or is it just something he said, or is it going to be the law, or?
Yeah, very good question. Yes, maybe. So in his executive order, well, what's happened, so I think that was maybe 2007, 2008. And for a couple of years, it sort of like hung out there and people were like, gee, okay, how are we going to do that, right? But the public agencies, the Energy Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, and the Air Resources Board, you know, all eventually sort of stirred their stumps and thought, oh, okay, I guess we might need to do something about this. And so they all started, you know, churning internally. The California Energy Commission enacts legislation that governs energy performance of buildings. The Public Utilities Commission regulates the utilities, and the utilities have their hands on some levers related to customer behaviors, and they create education programs and incentive programs and things like that. And the ARB has been a little bit more backseat about it. But so the CEC and the CPUC have been the main agencies addressing this. And what's been very interesting is the dialogue has shifted from, it's like, oh, well, this isn't a mandate. It's more of an aspirational goal. So they are worried. They're clearly worried about their ability to meet the goal. However, I have to say that in the last year, I've seen very encouraging action in terms of the direction the codes are going. So I don't know if you guys know this, but we have every 3 years in California, we have a code update cycle. And so the portion of the code that addresses energy performance of buildings is Title 24, Chapter 6, usually just referred to as Title 24. We also have Cal Green, which is Title 24, Chapter 11. And so what happened is, fairly early after the executive order, people started looking at the trajectory of our code changes and said, you know, if we just sort of keep on the same improvement curve that we're on, we're not going to get there. And so there's been some fairly aggressive work to recast, you know, recreate that equation differently so that we're seeing much more aggressive changes to code in the next couple of cycles. So we will have a new code go into effect January 1st, and then 3 years after that. So they're already starting to look at the 2017 code and what that's going to look like. And they are definitely ramping up to address that. And there have been a couple of very, very good studies done looking at both the technical feasibility and sort of the implementation pathway to make that happen. So I'm actually moderately optimistic that we will get there, not necessarily by 2020, although that would be wonderful. but that we will get there. So there was legislation quite a few years ago. I'm going to say maybe 15-ish, possibly even 20-ish years ago, that set out a statewide mandate for reduction of solid waste. That was AB 939. And it required a 75% reduction of solid waste by some year as benchmarked against some other year. And most communities didn't make it by the deadline that was given. And there were some fines, but eventually most of them got there. So I think this may follow a similar pathway. And as I said, I think it's encouraging that we're seeing the code changes implemented, and a lot of thought given to all the other things that need to be put in place. By the way, education being a big part of that. There's 6 working groups, each working on kind of a different aspect of the problem, sort of messaging and the technologies and education, and I forget what the other 3 are, but all of that is happening. So how are we doing on time? Oh. Okay, good. We can run through some more of these great questions. Yeah.
So I know we're very far from every house being zero net energy. Could you energy companies may have not seen like decreases in use of energy, but do you see any like pressures presented by the big energy companies against these efforts to cut down energy use?
That's another interesting question. You guys got good ones. In California, not so much so. Are you guys familiar with utility rate decoupling? Has that ever come up? No. Okay. So California, I believe, was the forerunner in this. There are a lot of states that have followed suit now, but the common thinking is, well, they're selling energy, why would they want you to use less energy, right? Well, we passed legislation in California, I believe about 30 years ago now, 35 years ago, that decoupled profits from the amount of energy sold. And so instead, the profits are regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission, and so they have to submit a rate case if they want to sort of change what they're charging, and it's scrutinized by the state government. And so if energy use goes down, their profits don't necessarily suffer. There's an adjustment made to rates to compensate for that effect. So, which is really pretty interesting. And since that was adopted in California, it's been replicated since in many states. I saw a map recently, and I was quite impressed with how many states have adopted decoupling. Some of them have only adopted it for electric or gas, not necessarily both, but it's clearly a trend that is continuing. So where we are seeing some foot dragging is in the move toward distributed generation. So you guys heard about solar last week, so you probably heard a bit about distributed generation, right? So when I have a solar array on my roof, that's like a little mini power plant, and you get more of those, right? That's referred to as distributed generation. Well, the major utilities in California, for the most part, have a somewhat precautionary stance about this. They're saying, oh, well, we don't really know what the effect of that is going to be on the grid, right? We're going to have electrons going both ways. They're like, it's electrons and wires. Like, what's the problem, right? You guys could probably answer that way better than I can. So it's really easy for me to minimize that that's like absurd. However, there are utilities in other parts of the country who are sort of saying, where's the problem? So it's interesting to see, when we have PG&E in Southern California, Edison and so forth saying, well, we're really worried about this and there's reliability issues and stuff. So now I get it. This is their core business, and it's probably appropriate for them to be cautious, because zero net energy means we are relying on the grid, and they're going to have, they have to understand what kind of supply they're going to have, at what time, at what demand, so how they're going to match that up. So let's just say they're embracing that with highly variable enthusiasm, depending on which utility, where in the country. So
were you saying that even when like energy use goes down, the utility's profit stays constant because the rates go up. So are you saying that even if users use less energy, we're still going to pay the same amount because our rates will go up?
Probably so.
So interesting.
It does kind of suck. But on the other hand, we do rely on the grid. So, and it's an interesting problem. And, you know, whether they will be allowed to have their, you know, as we sort of continue down this path, whether they will be allowed to have their profits remain constant or if they will be adjusted differently to be fair based on the service they're providing, I don't know. That's way beyond my crystal ball gazing abilities. But I think, you know, one of the challenges is that there's all kinds of information out there, and even builders who are promoting zero net energy homes, for example, you may see promotional that says, have a zero utility bill. It's like, oh, probably not, because there are service charges associated with being connected to the grid and having the service provided of, you know, when your solar array is doing nothing at night and you want electricity, well, guess where it's coming from? It's your utility company plays a role in that. So I am no apologist for the utility companies, but I think it's going to be a very interesting social experiment to sort of see how all that gets ironed out, you know, and if the utility's role ultimately is perceived to be smaller and less important and their you know, profits go down, or if they just shrink, you know, and the profits are the same proportionately, but they're smaller, you know, they have a smaller presence in our social fabric. I don't know. I mean, this is all going to happen in your lifetimes. You know, those of you who are younger, it's going to be really, really interesting to watch that play out. So, I don't know. Yeah.
How do you define, like, over a statewide scale, how do you define that a building is zero net energy? Because, like, let's say I move into a house, I have all sorts of electronics, I'm going to plug it in 3 seconds, and it is not going to be zero net energy by the time I'm done with it.
You've already decided that?
That's probably, it'd have to be energy positive before I move in. But how do they try to approach that? Like, the average user has to be zero net energy for the building, or what are the different ways people try to tackle this?
Right. Well, you're getting at a really interesting part of the problem, which is that when we design a building to be zero net energy, we're actually making assumptions about the electric loads of the people in that residence. But we don't actually know, right? This is a place where our crystal ball gazing kind of falls short. And so, for example, SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, did a program a few years ago where they built 10 identical ZNE homes. People moved in, they monitored the homes, and they found differences in energy use by a factor of 3. So it's kind of a big deal. So there's one of the big challenges that's being addressed right now is exactly that question. How do we decide or declare something to be zero net energy when in fact we don't have monitored data to say that it really is? So, and some of it becomes a semantic question. Well, do we call it zero net energy ready or zero net energy capable instead of zero net energy when we don't really know? So there is that sort of semantic problem. There's the prediction problem. So we're looking at energy simulations. When it comes to code compliance, we will be relying on some kind of predictive, you know, simulation tool, and it will be based on some standard set of assumptions which aren't going to match necessarily for any particular user. In fact, they probably won't match exactly for any user. So there will inevitably be the kind of plus minuses. I think the hope is that there are some who are net positive to compensate for those who will not quite make it to net zero. It's just one of those things, yeah.
If it's just electronics that is his problem, then it would seem simple to design a solar system that you could add to, a modular system that you could put a couple more panels on, a few more panels on, and he's set, or that he would be able to order his home to be a high electricity home versus a low, electricity model. Or
Yeah, that's conceivable. A couple of interesting angles on what you raise. One of them is that if we don't do a really, really good job on the building enclosure, we might actually not have enough roof space for even an adequate solar system, let alone adding to it. So, and of course, the more vertical we go, the less roof area we have for the living space enclosed. And we do know that we're in an urbanizing society, and so we are going more vertical. So this is another one of our challenges, that it's actually not so hard right now for somebody who knows what they're doing, they're paying attention to get to zero net energy on a single family detached home. But once we start to go to 3 and 4 stories and above, it's a little bit of a different story. Now, there was another angle on something you said. Now, what was it? Shoot.
Having a range of options?
Yeah.
No?
Oh, yeah. So thank you for triggering that. There's the notion of occupant-specific design as opposed to occupant-neutral design. And so even if you're, say, a home buyer and you say, oh yeah, man, I'm the electronics guy, so give me the super duper model, right? He may not be the person who occupies that residence 5 years hence or even 5 months hence. And so we also have that question of what user are we designing for? And sort of the fact that a building's lifespan, or in a building's lifespan, that building will likely see numerous different sets of occupants and or different occupancy patterns even with the same set of occupants. So, so my family, when we had an infant, we had different behavior patterns and energy usage now that we have a teenager. So, and I'm sure Leslie experienced the same thing, that things change. And so, that's one of our variables to consider. And what many of our forerunners in zero net energy homes right now are custom home buyer builders. Family X wants a zero net energy home. They have sufficient means to make that happen, and the home is designed for them and their particular needs, which may not look anything like the needs of the family of the future or even their own needs in a few years. So the question becomes, should we only design for this little narrow window in time, or should we try to design in a more sort of flexible way? I'm personally a big proponent of the flexible, like, could we make the enclosure enough better so that there is still roof space left over? So, and I think that's the right direction to go. So.
Was there any burning question in what was said?
Say, let's see, what else?
That's probably time for one.
Yeah. Oh, low-income housing. A couple people did ask about that, and I think that's a good one too. In sustainable building in general, one of the pervasive myths is that, again, it costs more, it's kind of a boutique thing, it's high-end, and as I said, a lot of clients who are really pursuing very high-performance goals tend to be building more luxury-type residences. The interesting thing, though, is that it's actually most achievable, high performance is most achievable at both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum than it is in the middle. And the reason it's very achievable at the lower end of the spectrum is because of regulation. So, say 20 years ago, I would work with builders, affordable housing developers and builders who'd say, well, we'd love to do that green stuff, but if we do that, we won't be able to build one more housing unit. That diverts funds, and that's our primary goal. So sorry, we'd love to, but no, we're going to build the extra housing unit instead. More and more regulations have come into play that influence the flow of money to affordable housing projects because most of them are subsidized. And those regulations basically say, thou shalt build greener in various ways. Well, when you've changed the floor for all the projects and they all have to do it, that part of the conversation goes away. And again, this it harkens back to the political imperative that if we change that floor of performance for all buildings, the arguments go away about, is it extra, how much extra is it, even though now you're all enlightened and you can see that argument as specious. which it is. But it's even better when the regulations say, sorry, this is what you got to do. You know, you want to have a livable planet for your species? Well, let's deal with the climate change thing. So talk to your political leaders. So, 2 o'clock.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for attention.